Sort of coming very quickly to the questions, I'll throw the first one at Pierre. Are there mining companies who publish their environmental and social data at the site level at this stage?
Right, so there are very, very few companies do that. Some companies do it and have started putting more disaggregated information. I guess the next step is going to be what kind of information they share. And again, is it limited to, a couple of quantitative metrics, like, this is, which is all fine and needed, like, how many people work there, how many are contract worker versus permanent worker, monitoring, water quality, air pollution, etc. But this could be clearly expanded.
Cool. The next question, Liesl, I'll sort of direct towards you, which is, and we've talked about this within the panel in a previous conversation about grievance and complaint mechanisms and how they are also part of an assessment framework. In your interactions with companies in the African context, how effective is that grievance mechanism, particularly when you're addressing legacy issues before new issues crop up?
Masuma, that's a very relevant question. And it's also something that's on the radar of good practice standards at the moment. I'm currently working with a client to make sure that vulnerability issues are addressed through their grievance mechanism. That, for example, voluntary principles of security and human rights issues are addressed through the grievance mechanism. So in an ideal world, it's a wonderful place in which to make sure that different stakeholders can voice their grievances, issues, etc., and that it's addressed in a very structured way. What I see often, and this brings me to a point, is when I do a due diligence or audit, I always ask, please send me your grievance policy, and then please send me your site level grievance mechanism or your register. And that gap is really evidence of that trust deficit we've talked about. What is a company standard on a corporate level often in practice is very, very difficult to implement. Not impossible, but difficult. And it needs resources. If you really want that grievance mechanism to be accessible, you can't have the signboards up in English. You can't just have an email address. There needs to be a WhatsApp line. So there's a lot of very practical intricacies that comes into play when you talk about effective grievance mechanism. When I look at a grievance register and I see outstanding or open grievances that have been there for years, 2 years, and you look at the trends, if you draw a report that the legacy ones aren't going down, then that's a red flag to me. Somewhere someone's not listening.
Yeah.
Somewhere there's not. Sometimes addressing a grievance means that you have to sit in 3 consecutive meetings while someone voices their frustrations in an angry way. Sometimes that's what's needed, but that's not comfortable, and that's hard for the community relations staff on the ground to do, and often also difficult to explain up the corporate ladder.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. I'm sort of going to pick on one of the last questions that we have. Pamela, there's one more for you, Rebecca, so don't think you can go away yet. Pamela, and we've had this conversation before. This is about who takes leadership roles. Because I think, and this is a debate that we've been having in development studies since when I went to university, which was a long time ago, about whose responsibility. And that concept that civil society and private sector was starting to step into a space which should have been taken by the government. As we sort of move forward, and I like the term regulations, I like the term level playing field, but we all know how difficult these things are to implement, not human resources, financial resources, capacity building all over. Eventually, I'm assuming government, but how far do you think we are from that leadership role, at least in the European context?
I'm sorry. I think my son is coming home. So if you hear my dog, just tell me and I will go find my dog.
Please, cats and dogs are always welcome on these calls.
So you know what? I'm sorry. I just missed the last of your question because he was barking.
So my question basically is, in terms of leadership, how far away are we when governments take actual leadership and private governance becomes a lower priority than public governance on these matters?
How far are we from, I'm sorry, from what?
So what we're talking with Irma and Liesl and Rebecca is how private governance is playing quite a major role in assessing companies on this. And it seems to be that space should have been taken by governments. And in some cases it has been, and in some cases it hasn't. Do you think we'll keep going like that? Or at some point will private governance drop off because it's all regulated anyways?
I would need to think about that more, but for now, I would say it very much depends where you are. Now, as an American, I mean, Americans hate government. I mean, we just want government out. So do I think they're public government when it could? No, probably not. In Europe, I think Europe really actually is in a very, critical juncture with mining, and there are a lot of tense debates. And I think if government does not step up, and those are many layers of government, and if they do not play a bigger role in this and a facilitating role and really get more involved, I think private governance will absolutely try to fill the vacuum. I don't think it's going to be successful though, and that's the concern. What happens? I mean, where is the governance in any place?
Yeah.
So, and I think that the role of government and governance also depends on, in general, people trusting government. And I saw there was one question about COVID, and it made me think, gosh, in the era of COVID and people losing trust, at least in Europe, living in Belgium, losing trust in government, all of this is connected in some way. So I'm not sure I see government actually taking over in the long term, but I'm not sure who I see taking over.
Pamela, this would be a good time to talk about the Canadian example of BAPE. Could you just tell us quickly what that is as an agency, as an institution?
Sure. I won't, terrify you with my French. It's the Bureau de l'Agence Publique, something of the environment. But so it is in Quebec, and it is a quasi-governmental institution started about 35 years ago. It is funded by the government, and its whole mandate is to go and audit, in a sense, oversee the public consultation process in large-scale projects needing to go through EIA. And these can be government-led projects or they can be private-led projects. It doesn't matter. But BAPE is known as being neutral, as being extremely competent. They also have funding to go out to the local communities roughly 4 times a year. So they maintain those connections in the communities. And over the decades, what has happened, they issue reports. They assess a project on the participation only, and they issue a report on how well this was conducted. Mm-hmm. And in a sense, they have filled a vacuum. So those negotiations between community and company, because both trust BAPE, what BAPE recommends ends up with being everyone buys off on.
Okay.
And in that way, you'd asked earlier about kind of facilitating, processes, and it has actually made the permitting process faster because it takes out this back and forth, which is interesting.
And I like the idea of facilitator rather than thinking about them in 2 camps. Mm-hmm. Right. Rebecca, I'm going to come to you with the last question before we do summation comments. I've attended community consultation webinars and classes, et cetera, and we all know there are 500 indicators that people want to talk about, from free prior informed consent to which communities are saying yes, who's the stakeholder, yes, no, etc. But I also understand Irma went through the process of deciding what responsible sourcing looks like, responsible mining looks like, and what is included in that community engagement. Do you just want to briefly speak to sort of saying you can't please all of the people all of the time, and the balance you need to make in saying what we assess as community engagement and why trade-offs might be necessary in that assessment?
Wow, that's a big one. Why trade-offs are necessary? I mean, I think ultimately, perhaps I would answer this in a different way, which is to say, when you have a multi-stakeholder consultation and when everyone is around the table, each of the stakeholders decide which trade-offs they're willing to make. And perhaps that's actually the most important point of all of this, is that everyone needs to be around the table, giving their voice and deciding what needs to be included in this definition of responsible mining and where can we find compromise. And as we went through the 10-year process, there was definitely we called them sticky issues, which actually it was water and waste, I think, that we had the most issues with. And in those cases, what happened is that we actually moved the conversation to a professional group who still represented those stakeholder groups around the table and had more experience in those particular topic areas, and ultimately were able to make recommendations on what the actual requirements should be. And so I think what I'm just trying to say there is, do there necessarily need to be trade-offs? I'm not sure, but compromise, yes. And by having everyone's voice, I think that so IRMA, we talk about, it's the most rigorous practice or best practice. That's what we seek to put out. And then it also has mining at the table saying, this is what's practicable for the market. This is what we can actually do on the ground. So I think, yeah, that's what I would say on that particular point. And can I just say two things really quickly on two prior questions? One, I mean, Pierre and I think I just want to recognize RMF's role in all of this, in the work that both of us are doing to bring transparency. And Masuma, you asked about mine site level certification, and that's exactly what IRMA is, and that our audits are public. And I do hope and believe that those audits being public will then feed into the reporting that RMF does, right? So we both come at it a different way, but ultimately it really is about a transparent conversation. And again, the more information that you have, the more every stakeholder who is around the table is informed, can have those important conversations. And then I'll just say one thing on this question that I really appreciate Pamela's perspective on, and I'll just add to it in terms of government regulation. And so from the nonprofit sector, we hear often that one of the issues with voluntary certification is that it's voluntary. And we certainly agree, and we certainly see that it may just be that basically there does need to be a level playing field and the government does need to come in. At the same time, we also hear from civil society, as much as they want governments to step up and play the role, they also actually recognize that voluntary systems and that the market can be much more nimble. And I'll just give an example of that, which I think is really powerful. So in IRMA's system, at this time last year, there were 6 mines engaged using our self-assessment tool. And now there are 30 mining companies, sorry, not just mines, mining companies who are in the system and using IRMA. And why did that happen? Well, it wasn't from government regulation. It was from purchasers of mined materials saying, this is the type of certification that we want you to go through. This is the type of information that we want. This is the level of transparency that we want. And those were market players who came out. BMW and Daimler, for example, both had very clear press releases that this will be something in our contracting, and let the mining sector know. And so I guess what I'm just trying to say there is there's a certain fluidity and a certain quickness that the market can move in and can push change to be made. At the same time, we very much see our role, having gone through 10 years of working through to get to that definition, to say to governments, please use IRMA as you make regulation. Please look to this as a way where all of the different stakeholders that you seek to serve were around the table when the definition was made. And so please use us as a template for improving practices and improving regulations and policies. So I just wanted to add those 2 points in terms of how we approach those questions.
Thank you for those points, Rebecca, because I've got a list of notes and I was like, okay, how do I sum up this 1 hour? And it's an interesting contrast from all four panelists, because we are talking from Liesel's perspective, where company communications, company messaging, which seems very simple and is yet so complicated. From moving from that to what you and Pierre, Rebecca and Pierre work on, which is assisting companies in now, I believe the buzzword, don't want to call it a buzzword, is evidence-based. Stop giving us nice little documents saying, hey, we care about the environment, show us. Show us your commitment, show us how you're putting this into action, while being aware that communities are not an unlimited resource. They also have other things to do. So we need to respect how we choose their time to bring them into this assessment process. To bring it back up to what Pamela has been talking about, how in certain countries and certain approaches, this is the government's job and the government is expected to do it. And they need to learn from what the private sector and the private governance bit of this is doing. So in answering the question of what are the tools and challenges for assessment, from taking something that IRMA and RMF are producing, which is documented, detailed evidence, to what Liesel has been talking about, not scaring companies that they only want to show what good they've done, but to be honest and bring out actual information, to finally get to a point where it's like, oh yeah, they followed the EIA because I know my government checked on it. I can move on. I don't need to concern myself. It's a lovely spectrum. And I think it sort of shows us at least where a roadmap or a vision would be.